Okay, so we have, so let's finish up. We have about 45 minutes or so to go. So we've seen so far, right, we've arrived at this idea of my sketch here, nature and reason, nature which leads to reason, which shapes or governs will. The actions or expression of will is duty, and that sense of, in order for a duty, which we define as an action that has moral value, moral worth, has to be conform with this idea of the law. So that's where we're going to be at now, is to consider this question of what does Kant think of, what is this idea of the law? What's the importance of this? So the law, which you'll see here, there's a distinction between what Kant calls law and the idea of the maxim. So the law is the objective in and itself. So we might say, for example, discriminating against another rational being is wrong. For example, that might be the law. And then the maxims would be the things that follow from it, right? The subjective principles, the way that you as an individual frame your will in terms of the duty then that you carry out, or the duty that you have, as it then reflects that underlying law. So let's take a look at what he says about the nature of law. Again, we're still here in the end of part 1, which he gives us this sort of very fundamental, very famous idea. So he reiterates, again, this confusing point, this point that seems to be so counterintuitive, that the morality or the moral worth of action is completely independent of the outcome that it creates. Right? As he says, the moral worth of the action lies not in the effect to be expected from it, but merely from the good, from the will, right, that's actually willing the action. If the will is good, then the action itself has moral worth. Thus not in any principle of action which needs to get its motives from this expected effects. For all these effects, etc., could be brought. So let's continue down. You'll see the next bit that I've highlighted. Nothing other than the representation of the law in itself, which obviously occurs only in the rational being. So to Elena, to your question about well, what about people who have, say, psychopathic tendencies? You'll see there that we this important idea that this about rational beings, right? Because it's will shaped by reason. If for some reason you're suffering from psychopathic tendencies, then I think for Kant, you could explain that away by saying, okay, well, there's a problem with your rationality. So nothing other than the representation of the law in itself, which obviously occurs only in the rational being, insofar as it, and not the hope for effect, is the determining ground or basis of the will, right? So it's not the outcome that you're seeking. Instead, it is merely the principle upon which you're acting, which comes back to this idea of from duty, right? That duty is from the underlying principle. Okay. So this, therefore, constitutes that so preeminent good which we call moral, which is already present in the person himself who acts in accordance with it, but must not, first of all, be expected from the effect. So another way of saying this is we all have, at the level of our common sense, some idea of what it means to engage in moral action versus immoral action, right? All of us know certain things are right, certain things are wrong. We have that basic idea. But what we don't have is a pure sense of what that morality is. Most of us live our lives in such a way that the morality we practice is a contingent or circumstantial, a Humean morality based on the outcome we expect it to achieve, not moral action for its own sake, in and of itself. So therefore he asks, well, what kind of law can it be whose representation, without even taking account of the effect expected from it, must determine the will so that it can be called good absolutely and without any limitation? And he says, you can see, I'll skip the next little bit, the answer to that question is, the law, what kind of law is it? It's a law that fulfills this basic idea. I ought never to conduct myself except so that I could also will that my maxim, right, the subjective principle that's governing the duty that follows from my will, that I could also will that my maxim become a universal law, that it apply to all people. So for example, that I shall not cause harm or pain or suffering in another entity. Could I will that to be a universal law? Is that good for all people at all times to sort of incorporate or to understand as part of their moral self? The answer is yes. So therefore, that's the idea, that if it's something that can become a universal moral law, this then defines the laws that to which then our duty must conform, right? That I could also will that my maxim become a universal law, a law outside of any circumstance or contingency or time or place. It is always, I could will that it's a universal law, always to be honest, always to be truthful, right? Always to be candid, forthright when dealing with other people, etc. So we've now added to our sketch, right? Nature, reason, good will, duty, and now the law that we had up there, right, from here, that the nature that duty, as he says, must the necessity of acting from respect for the law. Well, we've now modified that idea of respect for the law because it's respect for universal law, that there is a universal law which proceeds then from these maxims. Therefore, as he says, I need no knowledge of the world. He calls it well-informed shrewdness. Again, a nod to Hume. I don't need experience. I don't need to be well-traveled or have had lots of life experience to know what I have to do in order to make my will, my volition, morally good. I don't need to experiment first to find out if causing harm to other people is morally good or bad, right? I should know this before that. This is a kind of a prior knowledge, an a priori knowledge. I only need to be able to ask myself, can you will also that your maxim should become a universal law? And this is what I call the Kantian golden rule. That it's always, therefore, going to be not experiential, but something that you can ask as a function of reason itself. Reason tells you that it is always bad to harm or hurt another. And you don't need then to have some kind of knowledge of the world in order to learn that. Yes, Sam, question.
Yes, so I had a question about the universalization of maxims that I'm finding a bit difficult to grasp because, and you speak about how, Kant speaks about how in determining the maxims you should think about the intent behind our actions, and in doing so, it should have nothing to do with the consequences or the potential consequences, but I'm not finding it difficult to understand how you can identify the presence of, I guess, the contradictions that arise in determining these maxims without envisioning the consequences. I'm not sure.
I know what you're saying. You're grappling with the thing that everyone grapples with when they read this sort of Kantian framework for morality. How can we separate the moral? How can we separate the morality that informs duty from the consequences that it creates? Right? To come back to the famous example that we give, how could we then argue that someone who tells the truth to the Gestapo at your front door, that indeed you're harboring people who, through no fault of their own, will be arrested and sent to certain death? How could that ever be considered a moral action? Right? This is the problem that we have. Therefore, it seems like Kant has led us into a sort of a dead end. Right? That this is an epistemological dead end in terms of where his inquiry is leading us. However, the question that Kant would want you to grapple with, right? The question he'd want you to ask is, do you want to live in a world where you end up having to have people hide in your house because, despite their innocence and the fact that they deserve no harm, that nonetheless there is a system out there that wishes to practice harm upon them? Is that a world in which you wish to live? And if the answer to that is no, then what it means is you're living in a world where the morality of that world is highly imperfect because it's giving rise to all of these amoral or immoral actions. Bad things are happening in the world. Do you aspire, therefore, to live in a world where only good things happen? That is, as it were, conforms to a perfect moral universe? And surely the answer to that is yes. Right? Because ultimately, if we have this understanding of morality, we don't want to live in a world where other people do harm or people do harm to other people and so on. So if we have that aspiration, the underlying question that we have to then think that Kant wants us to think about is not, okay, I'm here in this particular place and maybe I can imagine that, as I say, there's 1,001 possible scenarios where you can imagine that lying or even murdering or cheating or whatever might be the right thing. But the fact that you are therefore required to engage in that action to get some outcome that you want that may seem to conform with your morality suggests there's an underlying flaw with the moral system in which you live. right? So the problem is not that you're telling the truth to the Gestapo officers at the front door. The problem is that they're there in the first place. That's the problem you're really trying to solve. And as a responsible human individual, this is where you should be focusing your attention. To focus your attention on saving the people in your attic is a circumstantial concern. The fundamental concern is the presence of this we might call injustice or pervasive immorality. How do we solve that, right? So it's a good point. But this is what I think he wants us to ask. He says, therefore, can you will that your maxim should become a universal law? And he continues, if not, then it is reprehensible. You shouldn't do it. And this is not for the sake of any disadvantage impending for you or someone else, but because it cannot fit as a principle into what he calls a possible universal legislation. So universal law creates universal legislation. The rules around which, or the rules around us that govern our behavior in the societies in which we live. And he says that estimation, that it is an estimation of a worth which far outweighs everything whose worth is commended by inclination. So this is attempting here in this comment to sort of address this concern about, well, shouldn't we think about the outcome? It is my desire that the people hiding in my attic be saved. But in order for me to achieve that desire, I have to lie or not be forthright and so on. So therefore, I have to think, I have to locate, where's the greater principle? Is the greater principle the commitment to a pure morality or to simply acting in some way that's conducive to my own desires, my own emotions in this circumstantial moment? And that's what Kant wants us to argue, that you cannot make it a universal law that it's okay to lie sometimes but not other times. It doesn't work that way. So the first transition gets us to this point. We've gone from nature to the idea of a universal legislation, right? The idea of universal laws governing the conduct of man through all of these different steps. The key idea being here that we've gotten rid of judging what is moral after the fact and instead judge what is moral or learn what is moral, discover. He says we don't have to learn it, but we have to acquire it through reason, through enlightened reason, right? Beforehand as a function of reason itself. So it's not. So in this case, he's in the first transition, commonsensical morality, that what is moral depends on the consequence, that common sense morality is now being replaced by a sense of moral knowledge, just knowing simply what is right and what is wrong without making reference to the outcome that it produces. Okay, in the section 2, the transition from popular moral philosophy to the metaphysics of morals, right? Again, so in other words, we might translate this into English as sort of along the lines of people's everyday thinking about how they should be good people into thinking about how you should align the conduct of your life, the duty that you owe to yourself, to your will, in collaboration with your knowledge of pure morality. How do we move from one state to another, right? So how do we decircumstantialize action, moral action, and instead relocate it in a metaphysics of morals, right? In a pure knowledge of what is morality. He says, sometimes perfection, sometimes happiness, here moral feeling, there fear of God, some of this and some of that, all in a wondrous mix, right? Without its occurring to anyone to ask whether the principles of morality are to be sought anywhere in the knowledge of human nature, which we can only obtain through experience, and if not, if these principles are to be encountered in pure concepts of reason, fully a priori, free from everything empirical, and nowhere else, even in the smallest part. So another way of saying that is to reiterate this notion that if we want to argue that there is something called absolute morality, an absolute moral truth, it is wrong to harm another, it is wrong to discriminate against another, etc. If we want that to aspire to a universality, we have no choice but to locate it in something which is itself universal. And in this case, what is universal is the pure concept of reason. This is something that human beings have. And at some point, actually, in the text, I can't remember if I've quoted it here, he goes one step further. He says we shouldn't just limit it to human beings. We should locate it as rationality itself. Maybe there are other beings that we haven't discovered who also have the capacity for rationality. So it's reason as a function of itself, right? This is the pure location of a moral absolute. He says, from what we have pointed out so far, from what we have adduced, which means to bring to attention what we've pointed out so far, it is clear that all moral concepts have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason. We don't need to see the outcome in order for us to recognize their moral truth. That these concepts cannot be abstracted from any empirical and therefore mere contingent cognition. Again, we don't have to see the outcome in order to be able to judge it as moral or not. That their dignity lies precisely in this purity of their origin. Pure morality, we can call it pure precisely because it isn't contingent or circumstantial, right? It exists simply as a function of reason. So that they serve as supreme practical principles. Note that word, practical principles. They serve as supreme principles that guide practice. They tell us on a daily basis how we should act, how we should engage with other people. So there is that creates a field of action for ourselves coming out of this the purity of origin, as he calls it. And from the unlimited worth of actions, that it is not only of the greatest necessity for theoretical aims, when it is merely a matter of speculation, but it is also of the greatest practical importance to demand that their concepts and laws should be taken from pure reason to expound them pure and unmixed. In that seemingly innocent phrase, I think, lies a lot of the force of this argument. To come back to my response to Sam's question, do you want to live in a world where there is persistent injustice, where societies can structure or formalize discrimination against other people based on who they are or the things that they believe or their desires? That's the notion, right, that we want to live in a world which is guided by a pure morality, where things like harm and suffering to others, whether it be physical harm or mental harm, treating other people with respect, dignity, all of those things that we put together, right? Where is that going to come from? It's going to come from practice. That's a practical question. How do we lead our lives? How do we structure our societies? So when he says it's of the greatest practical importance, another way of saying that is, if you don't want to end up in a world which produces Stalins and Hitlers and, I don't know, Pol Pots and Kim Jong-uns or whatever his name is, right? How do you get there? You don't get there by adjusting your moral center on an ongoing contingent and circumstantial basis. You get there by trying to introduce into the world a moral understanding that is itself an abstraction, that is itself pure. A world which is based on a pure morality, a morality of pure origin, is a world which cannot accommodate a Hitler or a Pol Pot or a Kim Jong-un or a Stalin and so on. This is why, for Kant, although it seems unreasonable, is the word he uses, it seems to go against common sense, nonetheless, this is the only way that we can aspire to a better kind of society. And for Kant, I think it goes one step further. We as human beings have reason. Reason allows us to apprehend morality in its purest sense. Therefore, as long as we are living in a world which permits these kinds of immoral outcomes, we are not being true to our own humanity. It is therefore an imperative of the self. If you care about yourself as a human being, that element of what Rousseau called amour propre, then it is incumbent upon you to recognize and turn into, through duty, some sense, this idea of a pure morality that comes from a pure moral philosophy. How do you do that? The term he uses to describe the way in which this then gets translated into action, not through duty, but through the sense of lawmaking, how do I craft a law that I see as having universal effect, he calls the categorical imperative. And you may have heard this term before. The idea of a categorical imperative he contrasts with what he calls a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is a call for action, a command. You can see here he says, the representation of objective principle insofar as it necessitating for a will or requires the will to act is called a command, and the formula of the command is called an imperative. You must act. And there are two types of commands: hypothetical, acting based on circumstance, and categorical, acting without regard to the circumstance that dictates or requires the action. He says here, finally, there is one imperative that, without being grounded on any other goal, objective, or aim, to be achieved through a certain course of conduct as its condition, commands this conduct immediately. Immediately in the sense of not being mediated, not necessarily in the sense of time, but also meaning you don't have to think about it. This imperative is categorical. It has to do with not with the matter of the action and what is to result from it, but with the form and the principle from which it results. And what is essentially good about it consists in the disposition, whatever the result may be. This imperative may be called that of morality. So the categorical imperative is a call to action to act based on a pure moral maxim, right? In other words, to turn moral principles, moral laws, through maxim into duty and therefore into the field of action. And you can see that he then recasts the Kantian golden rule as the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is no more nor no less than act as if the maxim of your action. It is wrong to tell a lie. It is wrong to commit harm or suffering to other people. It is wrong to discriminate against other rational beings, etc. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, were to become, not will become, were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. A universal law of nature. If I act at the moment when I'm presented with the opportunity to lie, to save people up in my basement, what have I done? I've essentially allowed people to lie based on contingent circumstances. A world which permits lying or harm or discrimination or other things like this is a world which leads to people at my front door knocking, asking to take people that I'm hiding in my attic to trot them off to certain death. Do I want that? No, I don't. Therefore, I act as if the action through my will were to become a universal law of nature. For Kant, this is the way in which we can achieve or attain a moral outcome, and it's not a moral outcome, it's the moral outcome that humanity enfolds within itself as a function of nature. And you will see that we've closed a circle, right? A universal law of nature. We started with nature because nature grants us reason. What does nature want? Nature wants us to recognize universal natural law, right? The laws of nature. And so we've come through this sort of idea of morality for nature through reason, through will that is guided by reason to become good, expressing itself through duty, expressed then as a function of universal law, creating universal legislation, which is enacted through the categorical imperative, creating universal laws of nature, which then brings us back to nature itself. Morality, we might put it this way, is itself an artifact of nature. It is something that exists just as nature exists, outside of any need for transcendental truth. It's not there to be discovered, it's there to be used, and we simply have to then guide our reason in order to use it effectively. Now, I don't know if that sounds to you like a satisfying conclusion. If you are looking at committing an act that is quote-unquote immoral in order to generate a moral outcome, telling a little white lie, like for example, if somebody says, does this dress make me look fat? Or if I ask my wife and say, can I go out like this? Do I look okay? And she tells me a little white lie and says, yeah, Rolf, you look fine, knowing that I look like a complete dork. But at the same time, she thinks that's okay, because she doesn't want to harm my sense of my inner tranquility, my sense of self-respect, because she knows I'm a fragile human being. So she's very happy to tell that little white lie, as are all of us, right? All of us lead our lives all the time in this way. She's not sitting there saying, well, let me think, if I were to commit this and I want my will to become a universal moral law, so therefore, this is not how we actually lead our lives, is it? So part of the problem we have inside of this Kantian framework is it doesn't seem like this is practical advice. On the other hand, let's go back to the challenge that we find implicit in Mary Wollstonecraft. Why is it that when she was writing at the end of the 18th century that women had been discriminated against as a result of the incorporation of patriarchal systems permeating not just Western, but indeed global human societies for millennia, normalizing essentially discrimination, prejudice, and creating harm, both physical and psychological, on half the population. That was not seen as an amoral or an immoral outcome. It was a morality that was consistent with the circumstantial or contingent conditions of that society. Do you want more? Do you want better? Should we simply accept that for what it is? And if you do want more or you do want better, at that point, suddenly, the Kantian scheme doesn't seem so crazy. Because how do we ask more for the societies in which we live? We don't want to sort of fix circumstantially a little bit that's wrong here, a little bit that's wrong. Let's have a little slavery and a little discrimination against women. No, we want to establish justice, truths based on what? Universal moral principles. How do we enact universal moral principles? We do what Kant tells us, that the maxim of our action were to become through our will a universal law of nature. Slavery is always wrong. Discrimination is always wrong. That's how we get to these societies that for Kant, as human beings, we deserve. So it leaves us, in a way, the paradox of the text is a paradox not of the Kantian analysis, but it's kind of a paradox of the lives that we're stuck in. Because by virtue of our reason, we can recognize a superior moral vision to guide us in the world around us, but at the same time, we feel paralyzed because that field of action that we need in order for us to sort of get there feels very remote and distant from us. Let me finally conclude with part 3, just to note, and I want to link back to Rousseau in this final section. Part 3 is very short and it's very complex, and I'm not sure it's fully worked out. But what Kant essentially wants to do is to further, let's say, accentuate or underline the importance of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is not just about you doing the right, meaning the moral thing. The categorical imperative is about you reclaiming the freedom that you, as an individual, deserve. You cannot be an autonomous person. You cannot have liberty or freedom unless you are willing to act according to the categorical imperative. This is the goal that Kant wants to set out in part 3. And it links then back to this question of what does it mean for the individual to have autonomy? And so we have to do a little bit of work on that idea of autonomy, of having freedom, of having liberty. Let's go back to the distinction I drew in the first part of our class. Liberty is not to do what you want. That's instinct. Liberty means to act consistently or in accordance with what your reason tells you about how you should act, right? So liberty embeds within it the sense of duty, because duty is itself a function of reason. So another way of thinking about that is, since it's the categorical imperative which acting, through our will becomes a universal law, this defines the laws that then surround us, right? These are the laws that will then govern us, that decide what we can and cannot do. And as we've already discussed extensively in this class, a law definitionally takes away your liberty, right? Because it's setting a boundary on your behavior. After this is no longer permitted and so on. So anything that's creating a law would seem to be an impingement or an infringement against your liberty, against your autonomy. And we recall from Hobbes, perfect liberty means to live in a world completely without law, but that's not a very nice life that we then get to lead. So what we do, we give up most of our liberty and live under the Leviathan. We saw that Rousseau tried to change the terms of that Hobbesian bargain by trying to make it so that the people who were living under the law, the sovereign citizen, was also the person responsible for the law through the general will. And therefore, it cannot be a restriction on your liberty if you are the one who is imposing controls or restrictions on yourself. The restriction on liberty is when somebody is doing that to you. But if you're doing it to yourself, then it is in fact an expression of your own autonomy. You're exercising your autonomy to impose a limit on you, right? And that's the sense of freedom that we see recreated or recrafted in the Rousseauian social contract. And the way at least I read the third part of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is as an exercise very much consistent with that Rousseau agenda. How do I use this scheme to, as it were, restore or recreate a kind of liberty inside of the self at its most basic level? And we already know the challenge, right? The challenge is when you are governed by laws, in order, therefore, for you to have liberty that is consistent with living in a world that is governed by laws, you must, at some level, be the architect of those laws. If you are not, it is a form of tyranny, and your liberty is restricted. And this is essentially what Kant achieves in the third part of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Essentially, what he says is that the categorical imperative is your avenue to liberty, because it means that you are then the architect of the laws which govern you. The world of moral law is not being granted to you by some transcendental source. It's being created by you through the categorical imperative, through the actions of your will, and therefore the only way that you can be autonomous is by acting in that way. This makes you, in other words, not just subject to the universal laws of nature, the universal legislation, but, and here's the key thing, what also does it make you? It makes you the universal legislator, right? You are the universal lawgiver, in addition to being the receiver of universal law. And she who gives law cannot therefore be confined by the laws that she herself gives, as we remember from the famous formulation of Hobbes. And so that's, I think, what he's trying to do in part 3. Now, that sounds like it has political implications, but I think I see it as having much more philosophical implications, because ultimately the point about the idea of the universal, turning ourselves into the universal legislator, doesn't have the same political ramifications that the categorical imperative does. Instead, it's about, as I see it at least, a condition of the self whose consciousness is acquired by reason, and how we then situate ourselves in our own lives, in our own world, in our space and time, and so on, as opposed to the clear political consequences that come out in parts 1 and 2. So in conclusion, the reason why people have been struggling with this book for hundreds of years, since it was published more or less, is precisely because despite the seeming impossibility of what it proposes, namely that we should somehow divorce morality from the consequences of action, that nonetheless, that we can see that if we want to aspire to some kind of universal moral standard that applies to all people at all times, regardless of circumstance, that then any time we link morality to the outcome that it creates, we are, as Kant points out, essentially undercutting or undermining its claim to universality. And insofar, particularly as history has progressed through the Industrial Revolution into the post-industrial world, as we recognize that in fact we increasingly need to institute, as it were, universal moral standards in order for us to live in the kinds of societies to which we aspire, therefore, the concept of the categorical imperative will always, at some level, for all of us, have some appeal, even if we do not have an avenue for thinking through the practical consequences of what that would look like. But it's pretty clear, you can do it as a thought experiment. If everyone acted, if all rational people acted according to the categorical imperative, many of the ills of the world would quickly disappear, because all of the things that separate us, all of the reasons why we commit harm or injustice or create misery one person to another based on circumstantial differences, socioeconomic differences, differences of region, etc., all of that would disappear, because the basis for action would be relocated outside of the material, circumstantial, empirical world and simply placed as a function of reason itself. Let me then conclude very quickly. I'm going to drop the last lecture on John Rawls because of the incongruities of our scheduling. But I wanted to briefly mention that when we talk about John Rawls and the so-called original position in his theory of justice, Rawls is often thought of as a Kantian. And one of the reasons why he's thought of as a Kantian is that Rawls picks up on this kind of implicit idea here in Kant and applies it to the idea of justice in our own society. Some of you may know Rawls' famous formulation that the original position is, what would you like your society to look like if you yourself had no idea how you were going to be born into that society? If you did not know that you were going to be born into privilege or poverty, if you did not know what color you were going to be or what position you would hold, if you knew nothing about yourself, what kind of a society would you want to draw for yourself, right? And from the Rawlsian perspective, discrimination, particularly formalized or structuralized forms of discrimination, which we might equate in this case with injustice, are themselves driven by the circumstances of the world that's around us. Therefore, if we want to, in one fell swoop, think through the problem of persistent injustice in our society, we could do far worse than engage in a similar kind of Kantian exercise. Let's remove justice from the consequential, circumstantial, contingent, material environment in which it unfolds, and consider it at what we might call its metaphysical or its pure level. What does somebody who knows nothing about herself want justice to be, and then have to live in the world of justice that she, through that act of reason, creates? That's the Rawlsian trick, as it were, in the theory of justice. And now that we've gone through this exercise, you can see that that's a very Kantian kind of way of thinking about things. So if for nothing else, the methodology that we see here in Kant is powerful, even if perhaps you remain unconvinced by his particular moral vision. Okay, let's stop there. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience with me. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll see you guys next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.